Viva Farms is a farm incubator program, and we're trying to train the next generation of farmers. And a huge part of that is education, and workshops like this are a huge part of how we do that. The other large part is the practicum course. So there are several students here that have, that are in the practicum course, and some alumni from the practicum course, and some assistant instructors of the practicum course. Yeah, the practicum course is a really key part to training farmers. So I just want to say that, this is, thank you to the practicum students for being willing to open up your class tonight and host this workshop. Yeah, I guess I would just say too that this workshop is funded. Hey, Tom. This workshop is funded in large part by the USDA Risk Management Agency through a grant that we received from them to do risk management education. So, what we're going to be talking about tonight is sort of an overview of risk management and sort of what that means in context for farming. And then also we're going to be talking about crop insurance as well as sort of a means to manage risk. And so. Yeah, so thank you to the Risk Management Agency. We also have a guest here tonight from the Risk Management Agency, Joe Lynn. So if you guys have any questions that are above my pay grade, she's shaking her head. Yeah. She's the knowledgeable one. I'm the messenger. So I think I also want to thank WSU Skagit Extension. Because we're having live translation into Spanish tonight. So as we do every week for the practicum course and all of our workshops, Viva Farms is a bilingual program, so we couldn't do it without the support of WSU as well. So thank you all for being here tonight, and hopefully it's a good workshop. These workshops are going to be made available, in English and Spanish, and we'll put them online. And we'll put them on the Viva website, and we'll promote them widely. So hopefully this is a resource that's useful for people going forward, both locally and nationally, maybe too. The goals of, so essentially tonight we have two workshops. The first one's going to focus on risk management as a general sort of concepts and talk about the different areas of risk for farm businesses in particular, and talk about some tools and strategies to help manage risk and what that means. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll have another workshop, though it's all one evening of fun. But the second workshop, we're going to be talking about crop insurance in particular as a way to help mitigate risk, as I said. So. Yeah, so I had a farmer today ask, they were asking about the workshop, and it was what's it about? And it said, oh, it's about risk management. And they're like, well, what do you mean? What part? It's such a vague term in a lot of ways. But actually, there's very specific things it's talking about, and we're going to talk about them tonight. Risk. Maybe some definitions are in place. So when we talk about, risk, right? Essentially, it's the chance or loss of an unfavorable action, having an adverse effect on your farm business, right? As a basic general description. Farming is a risky business, right? I mean, almost everywhere you even look, there's risk, right? I mean, there's what are some of the riskier parts that come to mind for farming right off the bat? So lack of rain, right? So drought, and and more generally climate, weather, right? It's a big one. Yep. Hail, that would be another one. Pests, right? So, in a way, you could kind of put those into a big broad category of production risks, right? Those would all adversely affect your production. So when we talk about kind of the 5 key areas of risk, production is a really important one, and one that kind of comes to people's minds most often. What about some other kind of areas that are not production related, but kind of related to, I'm looking at sales. Yeah, right. So obviously, like, how much energy are you putting in to produce beautiful crops for market? And if you don't have markets, right, that's a risk. Like, I'm not going to sell everything that I grow, or I'm not going to get the price that I need to get in order to make it, a viable business, right? So that's sort of another category that would be put under as marketing, right? Marketing, and that can, so like definitely sales, pricing, those are big. Something else that people maybe don't think about quite as often would be legal risk, right? So like, less so with sort of small diversified farms that a lot of us are, but like there's contracts that you enter into, right? Even like a lease agreement in a way has legal implications. If you have employees, there certainly are legal implications. Like food safety risks. I think a lot of people have heard me talk about food safety quite a bit because that's like my thing right now. But that definitely has legal implications. I guess, so there's all sorts of ways that, you could get into a legal dispute over like zoning, right? Like how your property's zoned, or a disagreement with a neighbor, all those sorts of things. Yeah.
Does that include liability, or is that kind of another?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so like liability, right? So in terms of, you mean like in terms of product liability, or?
Well, that too, as well as people coming over and dropping in a ditch or something.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, so that's a good segue to talk about sort of another area, which in a way is sort of the most unpredictable, and that is like human, like sort of what we call human risk. And that's really important in terms of, just it's employees, but it's also family members, it's friends, it's volunteers, it's community members. So sort of the human element. What's that? Media people. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like, when a film crew just shows up and starts blasting you all over the internet, that's a potentially risky thing to engage in. So we've talked about production, marketing, legal, human, and finally financial risk. Which is a huge one, and that's sort of a different category. It relates to markets in terms of like sales and what you're able to sell, but it also kind of relates to some things that we talked about in the practicum last night around like cash flow, right? In terms of like is your business profitable? Are you able to get financing and get loans so that you're able to operate, these sorts of things? So. So the big areas are, production risk, marketing risk, financial risk, legal, and human. Those are the big 5 risk areas that we talk about in farming, and that's sort of as the USDA defines it, and that's as ways to look at our activities on the farm. So we're going to dive into those in more detail. Any questions about that? Any thoughts? I mean, does that? Yeah, I guess it's sort of like anything you could think of in a large part would kind of fall into one of those categories.
Give me the top 5 again.
The 5, yeah. So production, marketing, financial, legal, and human. Those are the 5. And so. Yeah, so obviously risk is something that is necessary, right? Like even in any kind of, in a vacuum, like, in a business setting, if risk kind of equals profit. Like if no one took any risk, then there wouldn't really be a profit there, right? So even the fact that you guys, buying seeds and planting seeds and fertilizer and all these outputs and not having a return possibly until later in the year, like that's a risk that you're taking on, right? Like you don't really know what the outcome is going to be, and you're sort of managing uncertainty, right? And so all of that can kind of fall into one of these 5 areas. So when we're talking about like risk management, we're talking about like dealing with uncertainty and how you can develop your toolbox in a way where you have more tools to like lower your risk to be able to make decisions. Like this really all comes down to like decision making and your ability to kind of do that confidently and do that in a way that you feel as though that you can, that your business is going to be well taken care of, and beyond your business, your family and your life and your workers, your employees, all these things, the customers that buy your food. So that's what we're talking about tonight, those risk areas. So we're going to do like a general overview of like the risk management process. It's really a step-by-step thing, and then we're going to look at each of these individual areas and dive into them a little bit more and talk about some of the details. And I'm hoping, feel free like to just like jump in with any thoughts you have. I'm going to try to like inspire some thoughts from you guys tonight and some comments. Yes. So, step one of the risk management process is identifying the risk. Didn't see that coming. But you have to know what you're talking about, right? Like what's the problem, right? So like kind of what category does this fall into? Like what is the challenge? What tools am I going to need? And we kind of talked about examples of each of those 5 areas, but like, if it's like say for example, the weather, right? Like that's a big production risk, right? That's kind of an easy one to identify. Saying, a customer calls you and they say, I've got, a grocery store you sell to, and they say, hey, I've heard from a couple customers that there might, that some folks are worried they found like a piece of glass in a bunch of kale that they got, and I traced it back to you, like what risk would that, what kind of risk would that be? Yeah. So someone said legal, definitely, like food safety, right? Which that's like, food safety is like, it's like a human risk and it's a legal risk, certainly, and it could very well be a pretty big financial risk if it gets to the point where like someone tries to, sue you for it or whatever it is. So like definitely, and it's also a production risk in a way because it's like, well, how did that piece of glass get into that bunch of kale? You know what I mean? Like, does my tractor have like a broken headlight or something and it fell in, or, was it in my wash pack station, or was it like, like at Viva, it's like we have people that come and pick up CSA boxes, right? And like that's a big challenge of like who's coming onto the farm and what kind of access do they have, and like how you keep people out of the cooler, but at the same time people need to pick up their boxes, and you don't have a lot of staff to like walk everyone to get their box. Like that's just something that like happens, that's like, we're trying to kind of figure out that because, the bigger we get, the more exposure we have to some of these risks, right? So it's just an example. Trying to think of like another, another example would be, like my neighbor who's a conventional farm and I'm certified organic, right? And I'm one day like driving around the edge of my field and I see some, the edge of the field looks like it's kind of, there's some discoloration and yellowing, and like you're like, maybe there was some drift of something that, that would not be allowed under organic certification. Like how would you classify that? Like, if you had to think about it in terms of those 5. Yeah, yep, and I mean, really, like, if indeed it happened where there was something applied, let's say, and people get wind of it, and your inspector, and like they're going to take away the organic certification for that part of your production. But like that's a huge marketing risk too, because like your whole brand is kind of based on the fact that you're certified organic, right? And so like, if you have a crop that's going to be kind of decertified or not allowed to be certified, like that's a huge marketing risk for like future marketing as well. So we could kind of like go all day on these examples, but I guess just pointing out that, a lot of these things, it's like it's not super cut and dry all the time, and you have to kind of think about the different areas. So we're still on step 1. There's 9 steps, just to, not to like, spoiler alert, there's 9. They don't all take that long either to talk about, though they may take longer to execute. So we've identified the risk. Step 2 is measure the risks, right? We're talking about like probabilities, variability, like what is the likelihood that this thing is going to be a really big challenge for my farm business? How are we able to are you able to quantify it in terms of like, can you put numbers to it? Or is it something where, you're just kind of using your sense around like how big of a risk is this? Using the example of like, potential drift from a neighbor's farm, I don't know, is that a big risk, do you guys think? Like, do you think that's something that's like a big deal and that might have huge implications for your farm, or is it, I guess it kind of depends on how you deal with it to some extent. Or like, hey, someone found a piece of glass in their, in their cauliflower head or whatever, brought, bunch of kale. Like, how would you measure that as a risk? And I'm asking because I don't necessarily know. I'm trying to crowdsource it.
Typically, we've done risk calculations in other industries.
Thank you.
We look at the low volume, high risk stuff. Does it happen? If it does happen, how bad is it?
Yeah, sure.
Or kind of the frost versus asteroid model, right?
Wow.
Okay, it could happen, probably not, but.
Oh God. Oh.
So that low volume versus high volume occurrence.
Got it. Like low likelihood, high consequence kind of thing. Yeah, I like frost versus asteroid because it's like it's so extreme. like the world will end or light frost. Yeah, that's great. And and again, like I'm not like a professional risk manager, so I'm sure there's like lots of actually terminology that people use in other industries that I'm sure would be applied to agriculture as well. So yeah, that's interesting. So identifying the risk, we're measuring it. Step 3 is assessing your risk-bearing capacity, right? So like, based on how big of a challenge this might be, like what is your business's ability to kind of absorb it? You know what I mean? So, saying you've got, the one saying like this is your first season and you've developed like 2 or 3 markets, right? And one of those markets is like, there was glass in your cauliflower and like I'm not going to buy from you anymore. Like I can't deal with that anymore. It's too risky for them. Like that's, you have less ability to kind of like absorb that, right? Because that could be like a big customer of yours. Whereas if you're more diversified and you've got more markets, well then maybe you have a little bit more ability to absorb some of that. For example, like, what is your ability to absorb like, hey, the tractor broke down and now I have to pay like, $6,000 to have it fixed, like what happened at Viva not that long ago, like what's the ability of like your business and your organization to like, like does that bankrupt you or like all of a sudden I have no money and I can't pay my employees or, thinking about like what's your ability to kind of handle these downsides, legal risks, like there's what if you get a letter in the mail and someone's like, I'm suing you because, I saw one of your employees driving your truck and they like, I'm like just going all over the place, but like, they dropped like a pallet jack off the back of a truck on their deliveries and like my car, you'd probably hear about that before you got a letter in the mail, but those sorts of things like how, do you have a lawyer? Like, do you need one? A lot of people don't have one until you need one, which is great, but also like, what's your ability to handle that? Or there's a flood in your field, right? And you've got a farmer's market the next morning, and just you can go on and on. But basically, the concept of like how prepared are you to deal with that? Step 4 is evaluate your risk tolerance. So like, people have different kinds of ways they operate. Like some people are sort of risk averse. Like I'd rather be conservative. I want to kind of keep it close. I want to like really make sure that, I'm not going out on a limb too much. The flip side of that is that like you can potentially, if you're playing it too close, like maybe there's not as much room for profit there, right? Like you have to kind of go out on a limb a little bit to be like, I'm going to try a new variety, or I'm going to try a different marketing model, or I'm going to, this company I used to work for, we had a delivery driver that would go out every day, and like instead of just like being like a delivery driver and like delivery driver clothes, he would wear this like gold jumpsuit. And it was like kind of risky because like he was driving our truck with our logo on it, and some people would be like, God, get this guy out of my produce department. But the other people who loved him, like really loved him. And it kind of gave this like personal touch. And it was like, so, in a way, like the gold jumpsuit represents like risk. I didn't plan to talk about that. But like, as a company, you could say like, hey, sorry, cool it with the gold jumpsuit, like wear your little name tag and the delivery shirt, and I just want the delivery to be like, just a delivery, But the flip side is, or like having salespeople, like when you're doing sales calls, of like, are you really like gregarious and you're singing, that might turn some people off, but then again, you might open some doors. So like that's just like a very strange example. I will grant you, but yeah, figuring out like what is your tolerance for risk and how, and obviously a lot of that's going to be constrained by your ability to handle risk, like your ability to bear unexpected things, right? So that's something you have to kind of think about, and you might have different areas of your operation where like, what I mean, like labor, I want to like, I'm not going to go to labor, but just just sort of like different areas, you might have different tolerances, right? So I'll leave it at that. Step 6 is, identifying effective risk management tools, right? So like, depending what the problem is, what's the tool that you're going to need? Are you going to need an accountant? Are you going to need a lawyer? Are you going to need, a new sprayer that will allow you to kind of increase your efficiency and lower your production risk there? Are you going to invest in a new cultivation equipment so that you're able to like, cut down on your labor costs? Like that's a tool, right? You might say like, farming in Western Washington, like there's so much weed pressure all the time. Like I'm going to really try to focus on weed control in a way to kind of manage the risk that presents to your farm business, which is large. Or am I going to, use technology? Am I going to, use black plastic on my strawberries, for weed control and for warming things up, warming up the soil? So all these sorts of things, like this is all like very general, but like, you're going to need the right tools for the right job. And step 7, professional assistance, right? Which may or may not always apply, but we do have a fairly good network, extension agents, USDA, there's, Farm Service Agency here in town. If the tool you're going to use is an operating loan, well, then there's good programs that might be available from the FSA or maybe your local bank. Or maybe the professional you're talking to is like an agronomist. Here, we work with like Skagit Farmer Supply, right? And like they will help us kind of figure out a plan to move forward, or they can recommend certain products. Obviously, most of us here and everyone at Viva is involved with, certified organic production. So that's a whole other sort of level of who you might seek out and. Step 8, implement the plan. Don't need to say much about that. Just like, hey, I've figured out what my problem is. I've figured out my ability to sort of, take on this risk. I've talked with some professionals. I've gotten advice, and I'm ready to do it. And again, like doing things in a controlled, hopefully like written out way is something that's really important. Like really kind of think through like what's my my fertility plan? What is my weed management plan? What's my labor plan? All these areas that we all operate in, and increasingly as like your business scales up, you're operating in more and more, and sort of like the risk goes up. The bigger you get, the more exposure you have. And then step 9 finally is evaluate the results. So like you've put the plan into place. Did it work? Did it not? How would you do things differently next season, right? As farmers, we get all these tries to like go through the seasons. So I mean, a lot of this sort of process, right, happens, like a lot of us do it like every single day in like a really quick succession. You're like, oh crap, there's a problem. I don't have time to deal with this, but I'm just going to fix this now, and then I'm not going to talk to a professional because I can jury rig this for right now, and then I do it, and later on it's like, hey, the thing's still working, good. The idea is to sort of like, especially now in the off season as we get down there, like really kind of approach these things. Once people get a number of seasons under their belt, it's like you're able to approach them in a more measured way and anticipate some of these risks more and more. And so that's kind of the goal. So we're going to talk about each of the Freya.
I don't have something for number 5, I might have missed it.
Number 5, I've got it right here. Fear not. Set your risk management goals. Did I skip 5? Everyone? Maybe? It's okay.
What was 6 too? I said it, but didn't say number 6.
Yeah. Identify risk management tools. Here, I'll read them again. We've already talked about them. So identify the risk, measure the risks, assess your risk-bearing capacity, evaluate your tolerance, set risk management goals. I think I did skip that one. Identify your tools, select professional assistance, talk to professionals, implement your plan, and evaluate your plan. So we're going to dive a little bit more into each of the individual risk areas. Who can remember what they are, or can remember one of them?
Financial.
Production, financial, legal, marketing, human. Nice. Good job. So when we're talking about, we're going to start with production risk, right? When we talk about production risk, essentially like ways that we can sort of, change what we're doing, right? We can continue what we're doing, continue to do what we already do, but do it better, right? So like, there's all sorts of ways that's kind of what we do. It's like, I'm going to stay with my current crop mix. I'm going to stay with my current tools, but maybe I'll invest in like something else going to make me like that much more efficient in my time. But essentially, no radical shifts. So you can kind of stay with what you're doing. You can reduce production variability by diversifying or using new technology. Or you can transfer the risk to someone else, right? Which, that always sounds like a good idea, but easier said than done, perhaps. So what are some examples of like, how you can improve what you're doing? Like, but, doing what you do, but do a better job. Like, think about some areas of production in particular. So like,
I have one from experience.
okay, yeah, please share it.
I'm transitioning how to think from growing a garden to growing a farm. And this year I didn't plant enough of whatever it was to meet the needs of like a case or a CSA or something. So next year, be a little more generous with my rows.
Yeah.
With the amount that I plant.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd still maybe be planting the same things, but I'd adjust the amount.
So you're talking about more volume. More volume that's potentially more appropriate to your markets in a way. Yeah. And maybe will allow you to manage it more efficiently, right? Because we know like if you have like smaller chunks, like getting equipment into the field, it kind of takes like the same amount of work to like connect the tiller and get it down to the field and hook it up. And like if you're only doing a bed or less, it's kind of there's not as much efficiencies there. Whereas if you can kind of scale up and do that, then your yield per energy goes up, right? So that's definitely something that you would do. So thinking about like economies of scale, right, is something that like that's what we would call it. Yeah, and then also like you say that's kind of a marketing thing as well. Yeah, I mean, other examples could be, fertilizer plan, are you able to refine that at all? Are you able to kind of get more specific with what your plants need so that you're not, spending as much money as you would be otherwise? Crop rotations, right? Like kind of having a more long-term crop rotation plan might be something that would be like useful in order to, it's got lots of uses, but might be able to kind of like help you do a better job of what you're doing. Irrigation is a big one, right? So like I know we had several farmers this year, like this was a really dry year, at Viva, and farmers who moved to a new soil type where it was like sandier, but they were kind of using the same irrigation systems that they had used previously, and sort of like sprinkler systems and overhead, and it wasn't exactly tuned in to like the right soil type. So like next year, are you using drip tape? Are you watering more often but for less time because you've got a sandier soil, right? Because that soil is not going to hold any of that moisture. So, if you do 4 hours of watering at one time, you're losing most of it. But that's sort of something that like, you have to kind of address in terms of your production. Like, how am I going to do what I'm doing, but do it better, essentially. So reduce variability, right? There's a couple ways to do that. One would be like by diversifying what you're doing, right? So like obviously, if you're heavily invested in like 2 crops, let's say, right? And the price drops out on some of those crops because, saying you do a lot of kale, right? That's the classic example. And then, this used to happen to me all the time. Like we'd be about to, harvest like a pallet of kale, and then a competitor would kind of come on with their kale, and that competitor, their business model was like, we're just going to do it as like, we're going to do it really cheaply. It was still certified organic, but it was like, we're just going to like flood the market and like capture all of the market because they had big volume. And so it was one of those things where all of a sudden you're like, like now we have no market, right? So like that's being so heavily invested in that is like a really big risk. Whereas like diversifying what you're doing in a way is, is a way to spread that out where some of your weaker performers can kind of be offset by some of your stronger performers. At the same time, that potentially runs contrary to, specializing in economies of scale, right? So there's always that tension in what we're doing, but certainly, diversifying is a way to reduce the variability. Integration would be another one, and that's sort of, like vertical integration. So like how are we able to take on parts of the business and have more control over them? So like, I guess one would be, I'm going to start, like an example at Viva, right, would be like, some farmers like use tractors and feel very comfortable with that. Other farmers are still learning, and so like they're kind of they kind of outsource the tractor driving, right, to to Viva staff or maybe to other farmers. And in a way, that's sort of like you're a little bit more at the mercy of like who's available, what their timing is, what the cost of that is, right? Whereas if like you're able to kind of gain those skills, I mean, this is all on a very small scale, but like you're kind of you're more vertically integrated because like instead of hiring out a tractor service, like you are now your own tractor service. Does that make sense? So like you can reduce variability by having more control over the parts of your operation, largely the inputs, right? So maybe it's like, hey, I want to start like a composting program. You know, I want to start growing my own compost, or I want to grow some of my own seeds. You know, whether or not that's a good idea, but sort of like I don't want to be reliant upon some exterior person that the price might go up all of a sudden on me. Like I want to be in charge of my own production. So that's kind of what we talk about integration. That's sort of what we mean. You know, when we talk about transferring risk to someone else, largely we're talking about in terms of production risks, we're kind of talking about crop insurance, right? So like what, in the case of a natural disaster or a plant, you know, a failure of a whole planting, you know, that's a big risk that we as farmers take on. And, you know, how can we transfer that to someone else? So we're going to talk all about crop insurance after the break. We're going to spend the whole time talking about that. So I'm not going to talk about that right now, but that's kind of what we mean, you know. So marketing risk. So, you know, essentially marketing, right? Transforming the production into financial success. A huge part of that is understanding how markets function, understanding how prices are determined, and what tools there are to kind of to take advantage of opportunities. You know, that's sort of inevitably one of the top questions, I think, when people are kind of coming on board Viva, certainly, and even just outside of like, well, what's my product worth? Like, what's the price? You know, and it's kind of an interesting one. Like, how do you guys as farmers, how do you determine price? Like, how do you know what something's going to be worth in the marketplace?
Your analysis.
Go to the store.
Yeah, I mean, go to the store, you know, but if you see, you know, a head of lettuce in the store for like $2.50 a head, you know, like as a farmer, I mean, it might be hard to kind of know, like, well, how much do I get, you know? Any other ideas for like determining price? I mean,
We do an annual crop plan, estimated yield for every crop and every planting and every thing on the farm. And we say, and we give an estimated price, what we think we can get based on the history, what we think we can get price-wise, what we can grow.
Yep.
And so we're shooting for that, and sometimes we end up with more crop, and sometimes we end up with less crop, and sometimes we get more money, and sometimes we get less money. But we're shooting to average that.
Yeah.
And so as long as we're getting close to that, or we produce way more, we can charge a little bit less, and still meet those budgetary goals.
Yep.
If we know that we spent a little less on something than we thought we were going to, we can go down in price a little bit to move the volume, but we're not to the point where we're targeting enterprise budgets specifically for each crop. It's kind of like, this is how much money we're trying to make this year.
Yep.
And this is the product that we have. So
Yeah.
if yields are lower, we're going to sell it slower
Yep.
for a higher price and be a little more selective with who's buying it.
And so you feel obviously, yeah, like, you know, you say, hey, I'm pretty confident, you know, you've got years under your belt that like I can produce X amount, and you also have years of sort of historical pricing information too. I mean, but
Yeah.
but
I mean, it's also, you go to the grocery store and you say, well, they're trying to make, you know, 60% of what they're paying the customer or something off
Yep.
that. Yeah, so, you know, remove a certain percentage.
Yep.
And that's what they're paying either to a producer, or that's what they're paying to a distributor, and the distributor's paying you cut to. So
Yep.
they give out the channels that things are being sold.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
So
great.
It helps you go to the buyer with the appropriate price.
Exactly. Yeah, because I mean, you know, obviously like some really good customers, like I always would have the experience where some people would like tell you, they'd be like, hey, you're too low on this, you know, and like those customers are like gold because they're like team players and they're like, I want to support you, and I, you know, and they'll also do the same. They're like, hey, you're too high. Like someone else has it for X, you know, someone else has a flat of heirloom tomatoes for like $23 and you're at 26, and like I love you, but not that much, you know. You know, but so it's like, you know, sort of that's a big thing of like, you know, how to price things, where to price them, you know, what services to use. So like, you know, a great one locally, you know, for farmers would be like the food hub, right? I know there's several food hub farmers here. Like that's a great way to like sort of lower marketing risk to some extent, because really, you know, you're paying a service, but you know, they're dealing with the delivery and they're dealing with the driver and they're kind of dealing with a lot of that stuff. You know, certainly like people who sell through Viva, it's a similar model where like there's, you know, you're able to kind of lower some of that marketing risk because there's a captive kind of market on site. You know, obviously there's a cost to that, right? So if you take on more risk and say, I'm going to do it all myself, there can be more profit in that, but there's also more work and more risk. So these are just, yeah.
It seems like part of the big issue is market share. You know, like I'd say, I want to start growing lettuce, but then there's a lot of people already growing lettuce. How do I know if there's still room for me to grow more lettuce? You know, or not that I want to grow lettuce.
Everyone, yeah.
But you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, like,
or, you know, even, you know, the, not the regula, but what is it, the other herb that, you know, that thing, but
fennel? No.
yeah, I'm like, I'm amazed at how much.
You did this.
It's like, I'd like to grow fennel. There's a lot of fennel out there, but on the other hand, I don't want to compete, you know, with somebody else growing a lot of fennel. Not that I do that either.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's, you know, so, you know, hopefully we don't live in a world where there's like a zero-sum game. You know, if we can grow the pie, then like there's room to sell more fennel, you know. It's not as if we're like, there's only a fixed market, you know, only 100 heads of fennel period are going to sell. I mean, just to use fennel, you know, hopefully. And as, you know, farmers that are involved with like certified organic production and, you know, direct marketing and local farms, like we, you know, certainly that's a growing market. So like theoretically there should be, there's more room for fennel, but I can't speak to you and fennel specifically, but like, you know, and it's also communication with your customers, you know, like having open communication and being like, hey, I want to do this. I'm thinking I can do this. And then demonstrating that you can, right? Because you need to have kind of credibility with your people who are going to be your potential customers.
Do we have access to the food hub information to be able to log on and see what the prices are and figure out what the market share is by who's demanding what? You know, like,
I don't think you do. Yeah, I don't think that's public information. Yeah, and you know, and I mean, you know, information is also something that like I think you'll find is people can like keep it pretty guarded. Like generally in my like Charlie's Produce, you know, like they're not sending out their fresh sheet and prices to everyone just to be like, hey everyone, like they only give it to their customers, you know, and because information is power, you know what I mean, that's part of their thing. So it can be daunting to kind of get pricing information, but you know, talking with other farmers that, you know, and with folks at Viva and just, you know, like, yeah, so I don't think the food hub has it just wide open like that. Financial risk, right? This is something that we talked about last week in the practical. We've actually been talking about for several weeks now, but you know, sort of things that like affect the stability of a business are, you know, the cost and availability of debt, right? So I don't know that many folks here generally are taking on operating loans to fund what they're doing. But I think you'll find as you increase and scale up, that's going to be increasingly a tool that you're going to want to use for cash flow management, right? So how much does that debt cost and how available is it? Does that make sense? Like, are you able to get a loan? If you're not able to get a loan from like a traditional source, are there alternative sources you can find? Crowdfunding and different things, you know, that you can use. You the ability to meet cash flow I mentioned. So as you scale up, like as you guys know, your costs in the spring are really high and your income is low. And how do you make it so that you're bridging that gap and you always have money in your bank account? And the ability to absorb short-term financial shocks. So like I mentioned, like the tractor breaking down, or any other thing that might happen where all of a sudden it's like you're on the hook for a lot of money. Like, do you have a rainy day fund? What's your ability to handle that? And then your ability to grow the business over time. Like that's important. You want to make sure that you're adding to your business over time. The way that you understand where you sit with a lot of these things come down to financial statements that we talked about last week. So, income statement, balance sheet, cash flow, right? These are all things that, like, as running a business, you need to be looking at and having a handle on in a regular basis. This will allow you to kind of manage your risk because you're going to know kind of what your situation is. Setting budgets for the next year, right? So like once you guys have a year or two under your belt, like you have the tools to kind of look and see, like, what am I anticipating at spending next year? Can I look really at my financial statements and be like, where did my money go? How can I become more profitable? How can I become more efficient in any number of these areas? And what's my plan to invest and grow my business? So, having a good handle on your financial statements. We talked a little bit about financial statements last week, so I won't go into them. But, essentially, income statement is like what you did over a period of time. Where did you have net value, net loss, balance sheet, what's your business worth, and cash flow statements around, like, by the month or however you break it up, like, what's my cash demand so that I always have money to pay my bills, So, and, if anyone has questions about those, we can talk more about them in detail. Some other kind of just main things to think about related to financial statements are like your liquidity, right? So like how much cash do you have at any certain time? If the farm were sold right now, if you sold your business, could you pay off your debts? That's solvency, right? Are you running a solvent business? Are you profitable? What's your profit margin? Like, based on your costs and based on your income, like what's the relationship of those two? That would be like your profit margin. And then your repayment capacity, your ability to pay back debts on time. So these are kind of like broad categories, but things to think about, like when you're thinking about the finances of your business, like how can I lower my risk? It's like, well, I need to first understand, what's going on. Legal risk. Basically, I'm going to kind of go over the broad categories. Contractual agreements. I'm not sure how many folks get into contracts when you're selling, but like, that certainly once you dive into contracts, like you're legally obligated to fulfill that. So something that as businesses scale up, you might find yourself getting more into. Yeah, Freya.
What's the legal obligation for CSA?
In some
way, the CSA customer should understand that it's a risk and they might not.
Yeah. I mean, really, like when we talk about transferring risk to someone else, like that's at the heart of CSA, which don't use that in your marketing materials. Yeah. Buy some risk. But yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not. Actually, I was supposed to say when I started the legal section that, like, I'm not a lawyer and I cannot provide, like, this is not. I don't know like what the legal implication is. I mean, I would.
Each CSA is free to write in whatever disclaimer it wants. So for example, ours says, like, regardless of circumstances, you will not be issued a refund for your box, like, except in extenuating circumstances, etc. Some others might say whatever they
That sounds nice and vague.
Yeah.
Extenuating circumstances.
There's definitely CSAs that specifically build risk into their program and like communicate it because that's their intention is to share the risk.
Yeah, like that's explicit. It's like,
that's like the point of the program in the farmer's eyes. I think there are certain customers that really gravitate towards that, and there are obviously customers that don't read the fine print and
Yep.
be pretty pissed off if they, didn't get
yeah,
food for like the last
Yeah.
couple boxes or something.
yeah,
I think like with Amy and I's CSA, we call it a CSA now because that's what the colloquial term for it is. But in our first 2 years, we called it like a produce box program because we didn't want the customer to feel like they were risking anything
Hmm.
going with us. So, like, we wanted to be like a sure bet, not a gamble kind of thing.
yeah.
And so we've gone with the CSA term because that's what everyone calls it anyway.
Yeah. It's kind of like CSA. I mean, my thought is that, like, CSA, community supported agriculture, like the support part was like we are sharing in the risk of this. Like you're giving me money up front to buy seeds, and if those seeds don't germinate, then like we're all in this together. But now like CSA is just like a box of produce that you get every week. So that's maybe evolved over time, and maybe people market it in different ways. But I don't know like the legal, yeah. I think unless you've signed like a contract, then you have a verbal agreement, which I don't know if verbal agreements are still binding in some form or another. So
There's a really great nonprofit that I think is based out of, I want to say it's based out of Madison, Wisconsin, called Farm Commons.
oh yeah,
I think.
yep,
They do free legal consulting and education for small farmers, and I think they have a lot of information on CSA legality that and they provide that
Yeah.
that free.
yeah. So that's one example of like a contractual agreement, though whether or not like you're signing a contract, but we talked about it like leases. If you're taking on a mortgage, right? If you're getting like a certifications, like when you get organically certified, like it's a contract that you sign. I mean, there's legal implications to that. Other types of things would be like your business organization. Like, are you an individual? Are you a sole proprietorship? Are you a limited liability corporation? Like how you incorporate has legal implications in terms of your tax structure. For practicum students, we're going to talk more about taxes and like that sort of like your business and how to incorporate. But just that's big. Laws and regulations. Like every time, even in organic, like every time that you use a product, like whether it's like a fish fertilizer or whether it is like the parasitic acid we use in our wash station, like there's a label on that, and like by buying that product and using it, like you are legally responsible that you are using it in compliance with the label. So like there's sort of an implied legal responsibility there just based on the fact of what you're doing, but just by using that product. So like, that's something that you take on as a farmer. It's like, hey, I'm gonna buy, Pyganic, or you know what I mean? Like I'm gonna use a chrysanthemum-based pesticide thing that's allowable under organic, but you still can't just like dump it all in your field. You have to use it in accordance with the label. So laws and regulations, watershed protection, salmon streams, contamination, right? Like that's big for like, livestock operations. Like there's legal things. They can't just like dump whatever they want into our waterways, right? There's all sorts of things that they need to do. And then another one, sort of public policy and attitudes even, which is maybe a little bit less of like a legal type thing, but sort of like food safety is a big one. Like that's something that's increasing more and more. Like people want food safety certifications in place, and so that's going to have implications. And in fact, as the new law, the new FSMA comes on board, there are actually legal implications for farmers of all sizes. And there's going to be an entire workshop on that on December 9th. It's going to be right here. Little plug. So yeah, and then lastly, human risk is a big one, right? Human health and well-being is really important. From yourself, your family, your employees, right? Like, what kind of risks are you taking on by like not having the right safety equipment in place? What sort of risks are you taking on by like having people who are spraying pesticides that are not licensed, right? Like there's and they're not following the rules. All sorts of things. Agriculture is like the most dangerous industry according to the National Institute of Health. And I don't know why, like by what measure, but that's what I read. But like it's a really dangerous thing. Like there's danger everywhere. There's risk everywhere. It's the day after Halloween. But it's true, So human health and well-being is really important. Making sure that your employees have enough time to like rest. They have proper like facilities to get out of the sun. That they've got access to water. That they've got eye protection if they're working on something equipment of some kind, and there could be shards of metal or whatever it is. Gloves is a big one, right? So just can't, that's a risk to your business, because when those things go wrong, they can go really wrong, and they can then kind of cascade into like big legal risks. They can cascade into other things. So being aware of like what the rules are around breaks, and being aware of what rules are around like treatment of people is really important. Family and business relationships are really important. So like, a lot of us work with our families, and we're like owning a business together, and just, it's like family's the most important thing. Like people get like, can get pretty sideways with their significant other if you're trying to run a business too. So just saying like that's a risk. It's kind of funny to talk about that, but it's like a risk to your business, because like that needs to stay positive. So like good communication is really important. And then, I would just say employee management as like an entire category. Skilled labor is hard to find, like good quality labor. So, making sure that you're taking care of the people that work for you. Labor can be one of the more expensive parts of running a diversified farm, and it's investing in employees, I think, will pay dividends a lot. And so, having training opportunities for them, having, goals, good compensation, all that is a way to kind of manage that risk, because like there are farmers that I know of that like get a bad reputation as far as like being employers, and it's really hard for them to find labor. Like people are like, I'm not going to go work for them, and like that's tough to get out of, So that's sort of like the human risk angle. You guys feel like we could use a little break, then get back into crop insurance? Yeah.